Flows are measured by sensors at all times. The South China Sea is currently the most disputed area. As you all know, China has been trying to expand its influence in the South China Sea. Now, it seems that Southeast Asian countries are starting to fight back in earnest. Today, let's take a closer look at this topic. Let's get right into it. In fact, as you probably know, China has been building artificial islands on reefs in the South China Sea and making the strange claim that the entire South China Sea belongs to them. Honestly, I just want to give them a piece of my mind. China's claim to the entire South China Sea is creating security threats for neighboring countries. As a result, Vietnam and the Philippines appear to be leading the pushback. According to a report released by Center for Strategic and International Studies, Vietnam plans to build artificial islands on several reefs in the South China Sea this year. This is a response by building artificial islands on reefs, just like China did. The land reclamation project, begun in 2021, has reportedly expanded greatly. Vietnam is said to be building artificial islands on all 21 of its occupied islands and reefs, which previously had only small outposts or bunkers 4 years ago. They began construction in 2021, and by June 2024 had reached about half the area developed by China. By March 2025, Vietnam will have built artificial islands covering about 70% of China's developed area. They are expanding artificial islands at an incredibly fast pace. At this rate, it is expected that by next year, they will have secured artificial islands on a scale similar to China. Vietnam appears unwilling to give this up, having just built 8 more structures. Their artificial islands also have infrastructure like ammunition storage. Barracks and similar buildings have been seen. Some areas are extending runways to 3,000 meters and enlarging islands so large transport and reconnaissance planes can take off and land. Vietnam has expanded the islands partly due to the Philippines, as recent conflicts between the Philippines and China have intensified. The Philippines and China have been clashing with their Coast Guard and naval ships, and 2 Chinese Coast Guard vessels were severely damaged. The Philippines keeps provoking China, forcing China to focus only on the Philippines. During that time, Vietnam expanded its artificial islands. China could have stopped them, but was too distracted by the Philippines. We should closely monitor the Philippines. Until recently, it followed a pro-China policy. But after President Duterte stepped down and President Marcos took office, the Philippines' diplomatic policy changed completely, a full 180 degrees. They adopted a strong pro-United States stance and grew hostile toward China. And they continued to take actions that would irritate China. Recently, the Philippines has bolstered its defense against China by working with Western countries such as the United States, Australia, and France. The Philippines and Australia recently signed a deal to boost defense cooperation. In their joint statement, they voiced concern over China's dangerous coercive actions, directly criticizing China. Several countries also have defense agreements with the Philippines. Currently, the United States, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and India have defense agreements with the Philippines. Since the Philippines is relatively weak, it has signed defense agreements with other countries to help close the power gap with China. Notably, the Philippines has also partnered with India, a strong rival to China. Recently, a peaceful mode has returned, but still, from China's perspective, India is not an opponent they can ignore right now. The Philippines formed a strategic partnership with India and held joint maritime exercises in the South China Sea. The Philippines is holding its largest joint exercises in the South China Sea from August 15 to 29. It's a large-scale military exercise involving about 3,600 soldiers. By continuously conducting these military drills, they're provoking China. The South China Sea issue is essentially China throwing a tantrum. In 2013, the Philippines brought a case to the International Arbitration Court against China's broad maritime claims, leading to a significant court ruling. The court decided China's South China Sea claims lack support under international law. China claims over 80% of the South China Sea as historical territory based on old maps, but international maritime law and the court reject these vague historical rights. Also, China's attempt to expand its maritime boundaries by building artificial islands was ruled illegal. International maritime law says reefs or rocks exposed only at low tide don't generate territorial waters, but China expanded them and claimed them as islands. The tribunal also ruled China's interference with Filipino fishermen's traditional fishing was illegal. In particular, preventing Filipino fishermen from accessing disputed waters like the Scarborough Shoal was seen as a clear violation of international law. The International Tribunal clearly ruled that China has no legal basis to claim most of the South China Sea. However, the problem is China does not recognize this ruling. The Chinese government insists the South China Sea is historically its territory and rejects outside interference. Since the ruling, it has mainly ignored it. Since then, China has intensified its aggression by expanding artificial islands into military bases and showing force with its coast guard. Therefore, the South China Sea dispute persists today. By increasing such aggressive actions, China has provoked the Philippines and Vietnam to respond more aggressively. Right now, China is facing a major problem. If China just leaves Vietnam's artificial islands alone, Vietnam's maritime territory will expand even more. But if China tries to interfere with Vietnam's artificial islands, it could face the same situation later on, since China also has quite a few artificial islands of its own. On top of that, if China directly touches the artificial islands, there's no telling how the Vietnamese military will respond, so China is stuck in a situation where it can't do this or that. With tensions rising in the South China Sea, the United States is likely the most satisfied country. The United States is always involved in the South China Sea conflict. The United States views the South China Sea as more than a regional dispute, considering it crucial for upholding a free and open international order. About 30% of global maritime logistics and over 70% of oil shipments pass through the South China Sea. If China were to take control of this sea as if it were its own backyard, the entire flow of international trade would come under China's control. For the United States, this is a security threat tied to the global economy, not just a regional issue. That's why the United States regularly conducts freedom of navigation operations to counter China. This involves United States Navy ships or aircraft deliberately passing through or flying over waters and airspace claimed by China. The message is clear. It's to show China these are international waters, not any one country's territory. The United States Navy often sends carrier strike groups to the South China Sea and sails destroyers and cruisers within 12 nautical miles of China's artificial islands to show these are international waters. United States involvement is vital to defending its allies. The Philippines and the United States have had a long-standing alliance, and under the Mutual Defense Treaty, if the Philippine military or territory is attacked in a manner equivalent to war, the United States is obligated to intervene automatically. Whenever the Philippines and China have clashed at sea, the United States has repeatedly warned China it is ready to defend the Philippines, keeping China in check. These are important, but the larger goal for the United States is stopping China's expanding influence. The United States Indo-Pacific strategy aims to counter China by creating a network with South Korea, Japan, Australia, India, and some European countries. Protecting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea also symbolizes the United States' leadership of international rules as a global hegemon. Because of this, China also seems to have reached a certain limit. Because China has been acting aggressively in so many places, it's become difficult for them to focus on any one area. Right now, they're facing checks from rival countries in too many regions. The biggest front is, of course, the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan issue is directly related to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. There's a constant fear that failing to unify Taiwan would undermine Xi Jinping's regime. Therefore, China must always be prepared to deploy large-scale military force in the Taiwan situation. If they overextend their military in the South China Sea, they'll be less able to respond to a real crisis in Taiwan. The main issue is the economy. China once solved problems with rapid growth, but its growth has now slowed significantly. Rising youth unemployment and a real estate slump are increasing dissatisfaction in China, causing a major South China Sea conflict and inviting international sanctions or trade retaliation. Chinese leadership finds that option completely unmanageable. In the end, internal risks like economic growth and social stability become shackles that limit their actions in the South China Sea. Another interesting point is the diplomatic cost. What if China attacked Vietnam's artificial islands to block them? It's not just about fighting Vietnam. All the Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines, would inevitably lean toward the United States. The United States, Japan, Australia, India, and Europe are forming a network called the Indo-Pacific strategy. The more hastily China acts, the more it gets drawn into the situation the United States wants. But if China just stays still, the problem becomes even bigger. Vietnam keeps expanding artificial islands, and the Philippines increases Joint West exercises, so if China does nothing, it risks losing influence. If China is tough, it faces heavy diplomatic, economic, and military costs. If it backs down, neighboring countries increase pressure, creating a real dilemma. China is now in a position in the South China Sea where it can't act freely. China faces challenges on several fronts: Taiwan, India, and United States economic instability, so it can't be as hardline as it wants, but backing down is also tough. This is what makes the South China Sea dispute even more complicated and dangerous now. It's hard to predict how things will unfold. Well, what are your thoughts on China's South China Sea dispute? Share in the comments. Thanks for watching.